From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the beginning of the Center for the Book's spring season. We have an early spring season. We have a list of our talks over on the table. I hope that you will pick one up. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the Center for the Book, and the purpose of these Books and Beyond's noontime talks is to introduce you to new works that are based largely on the Library of Congress's collections, or that have a special kind of project connection with the Library of Congress. Each of these talks is actually filmed for website presentation on the library's website and on the Center for the Book's website. We will have, after the presentation by Linda, we will have a chance for questions and answers. And I hope that you participate. This is a wonderful book, and you will learn about how it really comes from all parts of the library's collections. And it's an early Library of Congress contribution to not only the Civil War history, but of course the celebrations that are been going on with Lincoln and all of the excitement that's underway here. When we have the questions and answers, when you have a question, that is actually your okay for us to use your image on our website. There's a permission question here we want to be clear about, but we don't want to scare off any of the questions. The Center for the Book will have a number of activities this year. I am able to say that we are planning to go ahead with the National Book Festival. Our tentative date is September 26th, so that will be an exciting continuation of book promotion activity here at the Library of Congress. To introduce our speaker and her wonderful book, it's my pleasure to present Ralph Eubanks, who is the library's Director of Publishing. Let's give Ralph a hand. Ralph?
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Linda Barrett Osborne. I've had the pleasure of working with her for a number of years, and during that time, one of the things we have talked about is developing a book that would be for the young readers market, and I'm proud to say this is our first book, and I hope the first of several. And Linda is a writer-editor in the library's publishing office, and she's worked on a number of books. She is a co-author of the Library of Congress Civil War Desk Reference and author of Women of the Civil Rights Movement, which is in our Women Who Dare series published with Pomegranate. She's also a co-author of Oh Freedom, a children's book on the civil rights movement. That school library journal called Important and booklist proclaimed Sophisticated. Traveling the Freedom Road is based on Linda's research here at the Library of Congress. And without further ado, I'm happy to turn the program over to Linda. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John, for inviting me to do this program. And John was is actually not only the director of the Center for the Book, but he was the acting director of the publishing office while I wrote most of the book. So I want to especially thank him for that, and of course Ralph, whose support has been enormous. All my colleagues who are here have honored me with their encouragement and support, and I want to thank them for being here today. Also my friends, and even more, I want to thank all of you who don't know me for coming to hear about the book, which is a children's book, but we think it's aimed at junior high age children if you're thinking of buying it, or who the audience is for. It deals with some difficult history, hopefully in a plain way. It's an honor to be speaking here during Black History Month, and I think that it's great that we single out a month to celebrate African American achievement. But I'd also like to say that African American history deserves reading and thinking about all year long. It's American history. And I think we all, regardless of our roots, need to study it if we want to truly understand how our past has shaped our present. As I wrote in the introduction to Traveling the Freedom Road, countries have stories to tell, just as people do. And I really believe it's critically important for everyone, young people, but the rest of us too, to know that story. When I conceived of Freedom Road, I proposed it as a book. We got the contract, and I wrote it. I did not know that Barack Obama would win the Democratic nomination. I actually, it was before. It takes so long to do a book that it was really before anybody had declared themselves. And certainly I didn't know that he was going to be elected President of the United States. But I think his election provides a context for American history that makes the stories and events described in the book even more poignant and meaningful when you consider all the struggle that took a place to get to this point. Struggle, hardship, sorrow, also courage and persistence. And this book's stories, in turn, I think, make Obama's election more meaningful and poignant. Again, the past and the present are always linked. You can look at how far we have come, but always you look at how far we have to go, too. And this is the ebb and flow of history I tried to capture in writing about slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction, which is the time when the North and South tried to become one country again and to find a place for the newly freed slaves in the life of that country. I had it in mind for several years to write about this period for junior high age kids. At the publishing office, we had talked about doing a children's book, and I wanted to do it from an African American perspective. One of the great surprises and gifts of my life is that for 20 years I've been absorbed in the reading of and writing about African American history. But it was my research at the library for other projects that made me want to write the book as much as possible from a youthful perspective. Let's see. I had seen an essay in our Manuscript division, which was written in 1854. It's on the screen now. It's actually the hand of the student that wrote it. Incredible penmanship. I don't think it would look this way today. Actually, it would be typed today on a computer. But I had seen this essay, and it was written by Marietta Hill, and she was a student at Myrtilla Miners School for Free Colored Girls in Washington, D.C. That's the official name of the school. I sometimes think, she said, that slavery will never be abolished, and then I nearly despair of freedom swaying its banner over a suffering world. Sometimes a dark cloud seems to overshadow me, and I say, will slavery forever exist? But a voice says, it shall cease, it shall and must be abolished. I think there will be bloodshed before all can be free, and the question is, are we willing to give up our lives for it? Wow. This is an eloquent and prescient observation. It's by a teenage girl. And it was stored in, Myrtilla Miner has her papers here, and there's one little folder with student work, and you can see why it was saved. With this observation in hand, I thought I would look for other observations and experiences of young people in the collections of the library. So Freedom Road incorporates some things that come from the general collection, some from rare books, some from manuscript, some from prints and photographs. It incorporates narratives by runaway slaves, diaries of the period, anti-slavery publications aimed at children found in the general collections, but also in the rare books and manuscript division. There was an enormous amount of anti-slavery publications for children, hymnals, little books. There's an anti-slavery alphabet. A is for abolitionist, which you'll see a picture. Because of the way technology works, I couldn't get a picture of it on the screen, but there's a picture in the book. And I also relied heavily on interviews conducted with former slaves in the 1930s as part of the Federal Writers Project. These are held in the American Folklife Center here. Those interviewed were children and teenagers at the time of slavery, the Civil War and Reconstruction. They were in their 80s and 90s when they were interviewed, but they were talking about the period from the perspective that I wanted. And finally, many of the illustrations in the book feature young people in the prints and drawings and daguerreotypes and photographs from the Prints and Photographs division. There's no new drawing in this. It's all archival, and it all comes from the library. It's just that this is the opening shot in the book and just a general shot. And you can see, I didn't always find pictures of just children, but I found pictures with children in them, many of them. And these are the slaves of a Confederate general named Thomas Drayton, assembled for this photograph. But you can see there's a Union officer there, which means that they had already been liberated after the Civil War started. There's a lot of history here. And I don't know how much you're familiar with, and I could spend days talking about the specifics events of the slavery and the Civil War and Reconstruction. I'm not going to do that, but I hope that it will be clear that you all have a general background. Now, I wanted Freedom Road to bring to life the stories of ordinary people, and I wanted to set these in the context of major national events affecting Americans, such as the rise of the domestic slave trade. This is all where we get into History 101, the Fugitive Slave Laws, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the Republican Congresses, and that's when the Republicans were the good guys back then, Reconstruction policies. I've tried to explain these are capital H history events to kids and also to connect them to their personal stories, because I didn't just want to throw the stories out there without a context, and I didn't want the context to be so classroom-like that they couldn't hear the individual words of the people I'm going to quote. Well, there's an example I'm going to read to you. I talk about the terms of the Missouri Compromise. Missouri was accepted as a slave state, Maine as a free state. Slavery was banned in the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase. I'm explain all of that, and I hope simple language. And then I link these to the words of a former slave, James Abbott. He was an enslaved child in Missouri, and if Missouri had become, this is all my writing, if Missouri had become a free state, James might have gone to school, although not always in the North, actually, or in a free state, done chores for his parents, and played with other kids. Instead, he worked from sunrise to sunset and beyond. His master was sick, and this is the quote, lay from the opening of spring, about the time the flies come, till wheat sowing time in the fall. All that time he made me stand at the side of his bed, keeping the flies off him. I was just 7 years old, but there I had to stand day and night, night and day. Of course, I'd sleep sometimes when he was sleeping. Sometimes when I dozed, my brush would fall on his face. Then he'd take the stick and whack me a few across the head, and he'd say, now I dare you to cry. So that was one of the stories, one of the memories. Before I read more of these stories, there were a few general points that I wanted to make absolutely clear in the book for kids and all people who read it, beyond the details of what happened, the Missouri Compromise or the Fugitive Slave Laws. There were just points that I wanted to highlight in general. Okay, one is that slavery was a contradiction to the words of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. From the beginning, before we were even a country, when we were debating about being a country, this was an issue. And it was a contradiction that made Americans defensive on some sides and some uncomfortable. But by not resolving the issue of slavery at our country's birth, we were creating divisions that would continue to grow and putting off a conflict that would almost inevitably have to be settled in the future. And this is a theme that runs throughout the book, and I hope it's a basic one for kids to understand. There were people who thought slavery was good. There were people who thought slavery was bad. You got more and more people on each side as the country grew and became more complex, as it added more states, as I had to make the decision about whether slavery should be there. You got more conflict and more division. Okay. Now, another point I wanted to make is that slavery was cruel and brutal and deadening to the human spirit, no matter how kind an owner might seem. I think that violence, and not just physical violence, but emotional and intellectual violence, were necessary to keep the system of slavery in place. On the screen is a picture of a slave auction, and there's you can see families being auctioned. You can see a young boy at the center. And this is actually a fairly mild picture for a slave auction. People would be, well, again, I can't go into the specific history, but people would be crowded together in a totally inhuman way and sold like animals. I have another point that I wanted to make. Oh, here's part of the, right. This is the parting. Families were separated in slavery. Children were taken away from their parents. Parents were often not together at all. And this was an incredibly harsh and difficult thing to experience. The parting shows a mother and child calling out after the father who's being sold away. And again, it's a fairly mild illustration compared to the history, the real history, and the other illustrations one could find, but it's a children's book. This is Running Away, which many slaves did, and there are stories of fugitive slaves in the book, which I will get to. This, actually, I put in at this time when I'm talking about the emotional and intellectual impact of slavery on the slave, but also one thing that African Americans had to live with was the stereotyping of themselves. This is a tobacco label, and it shows a very happy slave family playing music and having fun and smiling, which is the way white people depicted slaves, and the argument that the South gave that their slaves were really happy, which was not in any way accurate. My next point. Not all slaves were black, and not all blacks were slaves. And the condition of being enslaved was passed on to children through the mother. So these are two slave children in this picture. Isaac, the boy, and Rosa, the girl. They were both slaves. They were both freed because the Union Army took over Louisiana, New Orleans. And as they did at a certain point in history, they freed all the slaves and put them into school. But you can see that she is very light-skinned. Children could be 7/8 or more European in background, but still be slaves. But on the other hand, as I say, not all blacks were slaves, which is, I think, a misconception. There was a free black community that I wrote about before the Civil War. Oh, there's another. She was also a slave girl. Her freedom was bought by abolitionists in the North. And you can see the kinds of photos I was looking for. It's very exciting to find something like this. And in such good shape. Thank you, Prints and Photographs Division. Now, here are a free black mother and son, very dignified, not poor, not ignorant, not any of the stereotypes that were applied to slaves who also had both dignity and courage in the way that they lived. I write about the discrimination, however, that even free blacks faced before the Civil War, after the Civil War, during the Civil War, and their activities as abolitionists. Some of the most, well, perhaps the most famous was Frederick Douglass, who's also a runaway slave to begin with. There's Abraham Lincoln and his son, again, a child's image. And part of the way that Abraham Lincoln figures in this story is that his goal and the goal of the North when the Civil War started was to preserve the Union. The idea of emancipating slaves came about gradually and to some extent as a tactic of war. And in fact, the Emancipation Proclamation, and this is not to underestimate the significance of what Lincoln did, but the Emancipation Proclamation did not free all the slaves, which is another thing that children often don't know. Only those in the Confederacy, slave owners and slaves in the border states, which were the four slave-owning states that stayed loyal to the Union, were not affected. And so the idea of freeing the slaves was a gradual idea over this period. Then there's the Emancipation Proclamation celebrated, and you see scenes on one side of slavery with whipping and auctions and so on, and of education and decent labor for wage. On the other side, this is a very idealized poster, but it represented the highest aspirations of people at the time. Okay. Now, the other thing that I wanted kids to know, and everybody, was that African Americans were not allowed to fight in the Union Army when the war began. They were allowed to join the Navy. So aside from its symbolic meaning, the tangible difference the Emancipation Proclamation made was to allow black men to join the battle for their freedom. Even so, they had to fight to be granted equal pay for over a year, equal pay with white soldiers. They had to prove themselves brave in battle to northern politicians, to the press, to the general population, which they did. And this is John Henry. I'm not sure what position I think he was an orderly. This is Company E. This is, again, later in the war, after 1863, when the proclamation went into effect, an all-black unit. Then we get to Reconstruction. This is Charleston, South Carolina. There are 4 boys sitting in front of the ruined columns of a church. That's my other point, another point, that the South was physically devastated after the war. No major battles except Gettysburg had been fought on Union soil, but the Freedmen's Bureau was formed to help former slaves, and it was formed before the war ended. But it was also formed to help white Southerners who were homeless and starving. They didn't always take the help graciously, but it was meant to help basically a war-torn country restore itself. Now, although the South claimed vociferously that it suffered from bayonet rule, that is, it was occupied by Union troops, and among them black soldiers, which they considered a great insult. And this was when the war ended. The actual number of occupying troops was very, very small, down to 6,000 through the whole South, including Texas, by the 1870s. Moreover, the presence of Union troops, the federal troops, was the only protection that freed blacks had against discriminatory practices. The Southern states tried to recreate slavery through new laws and rules. Recreate slavery, especially those governing labor. Okay, and there was a set of there were things called black codes that were begun in the 1860s, right, 1866, 1865, right after the Civil War, that set out very, very restrictive rules for African Americans. One of them was, I have the picture of the children here, and I'm not sure of the date of the picture. My book ends in 1877. This could have been a little later, but as I say, it wasn't dated, and I just wanted people and children to look at these children's faces and realize that they could be taken away from their parents, even after emancipation, if their parents were charged with not taking care of them well, and they would be put to work for white landowners again, and they might be taken care of by these white landowners until they reached maturity, which is really slavery all over again. What the freedmen themselves wanted most was to own and farm their own land. That rarely happened. Most became sharecroppers, and they often worked for their former owners, and that situation deteriorated as time went by. This is a drawing of a freedmen's village in Alexandria, Virginia, which was actually reasonably successful at educating and employing the freedmen, but it was not typical. Okay. And I just love this shot. It's no date. Sometime in this period, perhaps a little after, of people in the cotton fields. I don't know whether they were sharecroppers. I don't know if there's nothing labeling them, if they worked for wages, if they worked for their owners or not. And here's another one. Okay. Now, although African Americans voted and were elected to office during Reconstruction, within a few years after the Civil War, all the Southern state governments were run by whites, many of whom had been leaders of the Confederacy. That's 1865 to 1877. But in fact, states like Virginia always had a majority white government. So the image of the South, as it did suffer definitely from the war, Confederacy, the land was devastated. But in terms of the charges of rule by outsiders, rule by Northerners, rule by African Americans, it just wasn't true. It was a story that became and a myth that became a part of our history in the early part of the 20th century, the romanticization of the Civil War. And as I say, many of the leaders within 15 years had been leaders in the Confederacy. Finally, the educating the freedmen was a success story. Adults as well as children were eager to learn, and they had been forbidden to learn to read and write during slavery. There were laws against it in all the southern states, and they flocked to classrooms to make up for lost time. And this educational push was enormously successful, and one thing that you can't take away from Reconstruction. And now another point I make, which is true for the civil rights movement too in the 1950s, that any freedom and equality enjoyed by African Americans always depended on the United States government in this period, not the state governments. The United States government not only to pass laws that granted civil rights, and there was a civil rights law, and of course there were the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that freed the slaves, made them citizens, and allowed black men, not women, not any women, the right to vote. They not only had to pass these laws, they had to enforce them. And what happened in the years after the Civil War was that Reconstruction weakened and ended as the North basically grew tired of protecting the freedmen. And they were more interested in their own issues and economic issues, in industrializing issues, and they decided that Southern whites knew best how to govern the southern states, and that it ushered in a period of segregation that lasted until 1963. 64, the Civil Rights Act, and 1965, the Voting Rights Act. Finally, I wanted to make the point that despite racism, discrimination, and violence, African Americans reunited their families, they established churches, they came together in communities, they stored up pride, they were determined, they demonstrated great courage to get them through the harsh years of segregation in the first half of the 20th century. Reconstruction wasn't wasted. It gave them experience that they would continue to use and use later, gave them a sense of self that was different from slavery, in spite of all the efforts of white supremacists to take that away. I'd like to read just a few pages from Freedom Road now so that you can hear some of the voices that speak through the book. Actually, that first voice is mine. These are the Edmondson sisters on the screen. On the night of April 15th, 1848, 13-year-old Emily Edmondson, her 15-year-old sister Mary, 4 of their brothers secretly boarded a schooner named Pearl docked at the wharf in the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. Though their father was a free man, the 6 siblings were slaves because their mother was enslaved. And according to the laws of Washington, D.C. and many states, children born to an enslaved mother were slaves. Now, the Edmondson children had good jobs in the capital city, but their wages were not their own. What they earned belonged to their masters. And they were well treated, but they were not at liberty to live where they wanted to or to work at what they chose. And what they chose that rainy night in April was freedom. The plan was for the Pearl to sail down the Potomac, then up the Chesapeake Bay to a place where the 77 slaves aboard would be picked up, then traveled by land to the Free State city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The Edmondson girls hid in the schooner's hold with the others. They knew the risk they were taking if they were caught trying to escape. They would likely be sold to a slave trader. They would be forced to leave their D.C. home and would be taken farther south, where the chances of escape diminished with each mile. The Edmondson sisters might never work as household servants again. Instead, they might toil endlessly in the hot cotton fields of the southern states. And like many other enslaved people who had been sold at the whim of an owner, they might never see their parents or their brothers and sisters again. And this is what did and did not happen to Emily, Mary, and their brothers. Before it reached the Chesapeake, the Pearl was captured by those who enforced the slave laws. A slave trader bought them all and took the siblings to New Orleans. There they would have stayed, except that a yellow fever epidemic broke out in the city. To make sure the sisters did not catch the disease and die, which leaving the trader without profitable young and pretty female slaves to sell, they were sent north to Virginia while their brothers remained in Louisiana. In the meantime, their father, Paul Edmondson, had been trying to find a way to purchase their freedom. He met the minister, Henry Ward Beecher, who was a white minister, who had a church in Brooklyn, New York. They raised enough money to buy the Edmondson sisters and set them free. Eventually, 2 of their brothers were freed as well. and a third sold to a new owner, successfully escaped in 1859. Mary died of tuberculosis at a young age, but Emily lived to see the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution passed by Congress and ratified by most states in 1865, and she lived to have and raise free children. That's the way I told some stories, using my own words to give you a sense of what's in the book. I'm going to pass this. This was another. These last two. I'll go back. Nope. I've got to click on something else. This was another example of trying to make the life seem much happier of slaves. They're at a cotton gin here. I explain in the book all about how the cotton gin revolutionized the growing of cotton and therefore required a great number of slaves to process, to plant, to pick it. And this was a picture, another picture that showed white and black children playing harmoniously, but as I pointed out in the caption, that wouldn't last. That experience and reality and custom would teach them very soon that they were not equal, even though they might play together. Okay, and here is an enslaved family, again, looking at the children's faces, photograph taken in the 1860s. But I want to go back to just read, as I'm talking about stereotypes, I'd like to read a passage from a diary by Charlotte Fortin. She was a free black, and her grandfather was very wealthy and influential in Philadelphia. She went to a northern school, and this is her diary, her words. "How bright and beautiful are these May mornings," and this she wrote in 1854. "The air is so pure and balmy, the trees are in full blossom, and the little birds sing sweetly. I stand by the window listening to their music, but suddenly remember that I have an arithmetic lesson which employs me until breakfast. Then to school, recited my lessons. After dinner, practiced a music lesson, did some sewing, and then took a pleasant walk by the water." Freed blacks had very difficult lives, but they were, again, there's variety, there's complexity, there's humanity in this period. This may not live up to the stereotypes of whites, but it is Charlotte Fortin, an African-American young woman, in her own words. She also added, later in her diary, "How strange it is that in a world so beautiful, there can be so much Well, anyway, while many are enjoying themselves in their happy homes, millions are suffering in chains." Kids seem to be very, very conscious of, well, I guess as kids today would be conscious of the war in Iraq. This was the issue that surrounded them. I'm going to skip this. That's Henry Box Brown, who had himself packaged in a box and mailed to freedom. And I have stories like that in there too. And they did. It worked. He worked. He got to Philadelphia. This was an abolitionist society that got him out of the box. There's details about the size of the box and the length of the trip in the book. These are contrabands. After the war started, these are African-American slaves who ran away from their owners to get to Union lines, to get to the Army lines, to freedom. But before I get to a quote about that, I'm just going to say, I'm going to just read this one from William Adams, who was a young slave in Texas when the Civil War started. He says, this is a quote, "Just before the war, a white preacher came to us slaves and said, 'Do you want to keep your houses where you get all to eat and raise your children, or do you want to be free to roam around without a home like the wild animals? If you want to keep your homes, you better pray that for the South to win. All that want to pray for the South to win, raise your hand.' We all raised our hands because we were scared not to, but we sure didn't want the South to win." And here's, I'm going to read you because I think I'm running out of time, a quick contraband story. This is Mary Barber. Okay, she was an enslaved child. Her father woke her up in the middle of the night. This is after the Civil War had started, dressing me in the dark, all the time telling me to keep quiet. After we were dressed, he went outside and peeped round for a minute. We snuck out of the house and along the woods path. I reckon I will always remember that walk, with the bushes slapping my legs, the wind sighing in the trees, and the hoot owls and whippoorwills hollering. I was half asleep and scared stiff, but in a little while we passed the thicket, and there were the mules and wagons. There was a quilt in the bottom of the wagon, and on this they laid the young'uns. As we rode along, I listened to Pappy and Mammy talk. Pappy says that we are going to join the Yankees. We traveled all night and hid in the woods all day for a long time. When we got to New Bern, the Yankees took the mules and wagon and put us on a long white boat named Ocean Waves, and to Roanoke, Virginia we go. My pappy was a shoemaker, so he makes Yankee boots, and we get along pretty good. So there's another story. Let's see. Henry M. And there are more contrabands. This was actually a stereoscopic slide that was taken of a group of contrabands. Contrabands being before the Emancipation Proclamation made them freedmen. The contrabands were literally contraband of war. Union soldiers could take them as they could confiscate property from slave owners, and many of them worked for the Union Army in all kinds of positions, not in the military until after 1863. And there's some more at Camp Brightwood, and you can see, if you can see it clearly, there is a child in this picture too. And there's another young man, one of my favorite pictures, and a sailor. And as I said, the United States Navy took African Americans into their service during the Civil War before the Army did. And that's the wrong way to go. And another family. Okay. There's a great quote in the book, and it's long, and it's not even by a child, and it's about a minister who runs to get the first announcement of emancipation. And I can't read it to you because I don't think there's time, but I hope you will read it. It's one of my favorites. But I will read you the end of it because it, okay. He's got the announcement of the Declaration, of the Emancipation Proclamation, and this is his quote. Men squealed, women fainted, dogs barked, white and colored people shook hands, songs were sung, and by this time cannons began to fire at the Navy Yard and follow in the wake of the roar that had for some time been going on behind the White House. Great processions of colored and white men marched to and fro and passed in front of the White House and congratulated President Lincoln on his proclamation. The president came to the window and made responsive bows, and thousands told him if we'd come out of that place, they would hug him to death. It was indeed a time of times and a half time. Nothing like it will ever be seen again in this life. The passage reminds me so much of how I felt at the inauguration a couple of weeks ago. There were hard times in Reconstruction, and I have many quotes that show that, whether white or black in the South. There was a hunger, there was homelessness. But there was also excitement and curiosity. A lot of slaves did not hear about the Emancipation Proclamation right away, just because of communications and lack of them. They sort of passed the word down and along. Here's someone named Tom Robinson. He was a teenager in Texas. His story of hearing about emancipation. One day I was out milking the cows. Mr. Dave, which is his owner, came down into the field, and he had a paper in his hands. "Listen to me, Tom," he said. "Listen to what I read you." And he read from a paper all about how I was free. "You can't tell how I felt." "You're joking me," I said. "No, I ain't." He says, "See, you're free." "No," says I, "it's a joke." "No," says he, "it's a law that I got to read this paper to you. Now listen while I read it again." But I still wouldn't believe him. "Just go up to the house and ask Mrs. Robinson. She'll tell you." So I went. "It's a joke," I says to her. "Did you ever know your master to tell you a lie?" She says, "No," says I ain't." "Well," she says, "the war's over and you're free." By that time, I thought maybe she was telling me what was right. Mrs. Robinson, says I, can I go over to see the Smiths? They were a colored family that lived nearby. Don't you understand, says she. You're free. You don't have to ask me what you can do. Run along, child. And so I went. And you know why I was going? I wanted to find out if they were free too. I just couldn't take it all in. I couldn't believe we were all free alike. Was I happy? Lord, you can take anything. No matter how good you treat it, it wants to be free. You can treat it good and feed it and give it everything it seems to want. But if you open the cage, it's happy. Now, I just want to show this because, as I said, education was really important in this period, and people who had been denied the right or were punished if they did try to learn to read and write wanted to be able to read the Bible, for one thing, wanted an education, wanted to do what had been denied to them. This is an outdoor class, and I have a quote from the same Charlotte Fortin, who was a teenager. And she says, coming to school is a constant delight. She teaches now. She's teaching now in the South. And recreation to them. They come here as other children to play, the older ones doing the summer work from early morning until 11, and then come into school after they land their hard toil in the hot sun. Many of our grown people are desirous of learning to read. It is wonderful, she says, how a people who have been so long crushed to the earth as they have been can have so great a desire for knowledge and such a capability for attaining it. Now, as I say, in 1877, Reconstruction ended, although it had been considerably weakened before that, and the South entered on a period of extensive segregation and restriction of black rights, violence, the Ku Klux Klan brutality. And the North continued to be discriminatory. But I'm showing these last couple of pictures which are in the book because in spite of all of that, African Americans progressed. Here's a school setting 20 years later. Here's a family, okay? Some did own their own land. They did get educated. They learned they had the experience of holding office. They didn't forget that. They built their communities. They built their churches. They kind of got ready for the long years ahead in a way, and that thread was never lost. Maybe my next book will be about segregation for kids, I don't know, but that thread was never lost. I think just to finish off, it took great courage to live through this period, just to get up every day, from slavery in the Civil War and even during Reconstruction. And I also think that to make progress, it took the understanding and action of white Americans. As I said, in the beginning, this story is an American story. It is our collective history, and I feel privileged to be able to tell in this book a part of it. Thank you. Does anyone have a question?
Linda, I remember talking to you about your search for a title for the book.
Mm.
Talk about that a little bit because it really covers such a broad period of time that from a particular audience in mind. Can you take us through the mind changes?
Well, the informal working title of the book was From Slavery to Freedom, which I never really liked, and also it's a title for this book. It's a title used by John Hope Franklin in one of his books. I had Oh Freedom, the earlier book that I'd worked on, which was about the civil rights movement, was the title of a song, of a hymn that was sung in the Civil War and later. And many books will take excerpts from hymns. And phrases from hymns as titles, and they been in the storm so long. The parting the waters, either that or from the Bible. So I thought, well, that's the way to go. I'll look up all the songs I can and find titles. Well, every title I found was already, I went onto Amazon and onto the library, and every song I found somebody else had used. And I thought, what do I want to stress here? Freedom, but I also want to stress time. I want to stress that it's a process. So unbelievably to me, I came up with Traveling the Freedom Road. And I looked, and it wasn't on Amazon. It was nobody's title. Titles can't be copyrighted, so I could have used anything I wanted, but I wanted this to be distinctive. And then the subtitle, From Slavery and the Civil War Through Reconstruction, we hoped would explain what the book was about, and it was supposed to be clear, since it was published by a children's publisher, that it was for children, not adults. Although I've been told by very nice friends that it's for all ages. Now, my son, who studies African American, he's a PhD candidate in history. Thought it was a hymn that I had found. He said, it sounds so authentic. So that's how I came upon it, doing a lot of crossing out and thinking, yes.
You mentioned that there were considerations taken because this was a book for children. Did you intentionally avoid some of the particularly brutal accounts of slavery?
Well, I have accounts of people being beaten till they bled. My editor wanted that. He didn't want it to seem, he didn't want it to seem too kind or nice or just, wow, this is boring. He wanted you to see how violent it was. I mean, the one area I didn't, I mentioned where I have captions and talk about the light-skinned slaves, that they had European parentage. I did not mention why most of them did. I just couldn't see rape in a children's book, but there's definitely passages that show the violence, and there's a long section in the Ku Klux Klan and on the Ku Klux Klan and people talking about hiding from them, and so I'm not sure. That's why I worry a little bit about. I had imagined 10 to 14 as my age group, depending on whether a child is sensitive, but without that, then I mean, we're not telling the true story of slavery. If we take out the beatings and the bleeding, if we take out I spend a lot of time on separating families. I spend a lot of time on the emotional cruelty. So I think I cover everything as best I can and try to explain it without excusing it. I don't think the book excuses the Confederacy at all. I have no sympathy, if someone here does. But if you read the history, I have no sympathy for what the South was trying to maintain, the system. Yeah.
For a lot of reasons, we'd all like to be 13 or 14 again. But have you tried this out with the sample audience? What do 13 and 14-year-olds say?
One of my colleagues. Have I tried this out with a sample audience, and what do children say? A few children have read it. I didn't try it out with children before it was published. The Min, who works in our office, has a daughter who I promised would be the first child to read it, and I think she's 10, and she loved it, but her mom's mentioned in the book and all, and she's an exceptional child. But I have had friends who have shown it to their 12-year-old grandchildren. Now, they say, again, I'm not sure if any child would go out and buy this book. I think it's something parents are going to buy for children and teachers are going to buy, hopefully for schools and libraries. But they've said that there's enough of those voices and enough of the story that they've enjoyed it, but it hasn't been like a wide sampling. The wide sampling starts now. I'd love to hear what children think. The editor at Abrams I worked with, Howard Reeves, has a lot of experience, and we made some adjustments to the tone and the language. So I hope he knew what he was doing. And you heard an example of when I read the Edmondson Girls, of sort of the tone of the book. Yes?
Yes, did you discuss in your book Frederick Douglass?
Oh, yeah, he's in there.
He fought the slave breaker and to a draw, and psychologically freed himself and eventually became a escaped slave.
I did talk about him. I didn't tell his complete story. I talked about several adults, but I had 17,000 words, and and there's a picture of Frederick Douglass, and I did talk about how he escaped. And actually, I have a quote from him about educating himself in Baltimore, where the streets were, his classroom. So there is a section on free blacks and a section on abolitionists, which definitely talks about him and I. Well, I'm just trying to. My mind is going completely. Harriet Tubman is in there too. I mean, they are recognizable. And she actually appears in the book first because she's an example of violence, because she was hit over the head with a heavy weight by the overseer and suffered all her life. But then I do mention little bits of their story as I go on, as much as I could, without trying, without doing what a lot of other books have done well. Yes.
How many different divisions in the library do you think you utilized in your research?
Well, prints of photographs, and a lot of these images are online, by the way, and you can access them yourself. They're not all high res, so I had to get some prints, but they are online. Rare Book had some wonderful early abolitionist literature. Geography. There are two maps in here that come from Geography and Maps showing the Confederate and Union states, and also the way the United States kind of built up its territory. Manuscript. Oh, Manuscript was kind of the start of all of this because of that wonderful letter. Manuscript. Not motion picture. Not the law library. The general collections, too. Amazingly, we have access to the general collections in our office because we research. There are books from the mid-19th century in the general collections that I could just pull off the shelves. And it was thrilling to be able to do that. The whole working here is so wonderful, and uncovering this was an experience I'll never forget. I guess we're out of time for questions.
Not quite. I have one resource question. When you use the slave narratives, the narratives of the ex-slaves, what was the nature of the story? They were reflecting on their childhoods, or
People
how
were
did
asking,
you work that material in?
Yes, people were asking them questions about what happened to them. It was a project set up during the Depression to employ historians and writers and so on, and they would go out and interview them about what their experiences. So they might say, "Where were you living?" or "How old were you?" or "Did you ever run away?" or whatever. And these were the answers. I used a version that is print on demand. Applewood Books has all of them. We arranged that through the publishing office. Every word is there. The words themselves they're done in dialect. I have no idea how accurate the dialect is. It's that kind of stereotype black dialect. I'm sure people were trying to recreate the sounds they heard as they did the transcripts, but I edited them so that they would be a little bit more readable for a child in a contemporary audience. But that's how I worked with them, and they have enormous amounts of information, and also some information I won't go into that would have been hard to fit into this book that has me asking more questions. The most interesting was that several people talked about how it was worse after slavery for them. And I think they definitely mean from a materialistic point of view, from not being fed and clothed and housed, and maybe they did have nicer people who owned them, but that really surprised me. But overall, people wanted just what you heard. They wanted dignity, they wanted respect, they wanted economic opportunity, they wanted their civil rights, they wanted their freedom.
Thank you, Linda.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.